starter. Okay.
So I can see.
Okay.
Hej, velkommen til fredags forskningsseminar. I dag har vi en meget speciel gæst. Vi har en fra AHKR, Viser i månen, som skal snakke om trægenstande i Nordøsteuropa i middelalderen. Og det lyder super, super spændende. Så velkommen, Viser. Og ja, held og lykke.
Thank you, Sulai, and thank you for the invitation. So today I'll be discussing three main themes: artifacts, science, and eco-criticism, and I will do it in this order as in the title. And the kind of background for my paper is in a project that is about to finish this year, and it focuses on northeastern Europe and Middle Ages there from 11th, 12th century to around 16th century. And the idea about this project is that wood is kind of all over the place in the Middle Ages, and actually even before that in pre-modern world altogether. And we were interested in how wood was used, why was it used, and what kind of species of wood was used. And the idea is also to kind of shift an emphasis a bit more from ceramics and metal objects and so on, those categories of objects that have been studied quite a lot. Of course, there's a lot of publications on wooden artifacts, but there isn't still very many kind of overviews or kind of publications that would try to grasp archaeology, art history all together in one volume. And what we were asking in this project was, of course, what kind of objects were made of wood, for what purposes, but in addition to that, how wood and wooden objects were moved from forest as a timber to village or town, how it was processed, and so on. And what does these movements of wood and uses of wood tell about people living in the Middle Ages, about the environment and how people reacted or interacted with the environment? And because we are also interested in art historical objects, so sculptures from churches, also kind of divine aspect is present in our project. And today, after some introductory words and main concepts that I will be using, then I will be saying and showing some artifacts that we have been working with, and then talk about science, so what kind of scientific analysis we have been using in studying wood. And lastly, I use these results on artifacts and science to discuss what can be called an eco-criticism. It's a kind of movement, and what specifically is medieval eco-criticism, and how sustainability can be approached by studying objects, wooden objects. But first, some introductory words. So our project is an interdisciplinary project with several scholars from different fields, but we mainly work on northeastern Europe and Finland, but also some material is from northern Sweden and northern Russia. And this region is interesting because it's a kind of in between urbanized Europe. It's the most northern towns are located in this area in the Middle Ages, and beyond that there are big forests, northern subarctic forests, so providing a lot of wood to use. And that's why wood is kind of very special for subsistence, for survival in these areas. And the Middle Ages is interesting in this region because it means the establishment of first states. Finland and northern Eastern Europe becomes part of the Kingdom of Sweden, and Christianity is established, so big changes in the society. And then we work on through the Middle Ages and end around 1600, which is way after kind of the proper Middle Ages, but many processes continue quite far even after the Middle Ages. And that endpoint is marked with the foundation of national states, polarization of social classes. They were also in the Middle Ages social classes, but they become more distinct, more polarized, more expressed in the society. And of course, Atlantic trade expands trade networks and kind of revolutionizes economics in that era. But these are kind of the framework I am talking in. So if food is everywhere in these pre-modern societies and communities, how could we approach them, this material, and the people who use this material, and how we can bring together very different kind of scholars, art historians, archaeologists, and historians. And in our project, the solution were some conceptual basis that we all shared in our work. First thing is, of course, materiality. So wood is a material, and it has certain characteristics. There are different wood species, and they have different kind of qualities that we were interested in. So basically, physical objects and their form and the shape and ornamentation and so on. But also perhaps more abstract things like meanings and ideas attached to wood. So try to combine some very concrete things and some very abstract things. Because we are interested in wood as a material, we were trying to find out if wood or specific species had any specific meanings or significance. Maybe our approach could be described with the idea presented by Mary Weismantel and Lynn Meskel, following the material and show what that brings about. In addition to kind of these material aspects, we share the interest in object biography. So in a very basic way, you could say that object biography describes how one object or group of objects, how they were produced, processed, distributed, used, and then thrown away or burned or whatever. So kind of trying to reconstruct these kind of life courses of objects. And as part of that reconstruction, to think how people are part of these life courses and biographies. Archaeologists, of course, have been using this idea of object biographies quite a long time, since the 1980s, and kind of trying to think about life cycles of objects and how they are related to people who use them. But also art historians have used for this kind of approach, especially in recent years. A lot of medieval art history has been interested in the material aspects of sculptures in churches, how they were made, what kind of changes happened to them throughout the centuries, and so on. And this is kind of example what kind of art history we were interested in. We were interested in very basic conservation, how these objects were made and put together and what had happened to them during the Middle Ages. Of course, the object biography approach has been criticized for the last 10, 20 years now. Biography as a concept can be considered too humanizing, that objects are objects, they don't have life cycles in the same sense as humans. And if an object becomes fragmented, if you have a pot that breaks down, or you have a wooden object that is kind of splintered, it doesn't really kind of die. It has just transformed into a set of fragments, and that's why biography is can be a problematic in this context. And the suggestion has been that instead of biographies, we should talk about itineraries. So how objects have changed as objects and how they have been used. And what is the relationship between these itineraries and human biographies. And the concept of itinerary, it deals better with continuity or discontinuity, because biography usually means that you have one entity that changes, whereas itinerary can be used to describe the movement of individual fragments. And biography can be too linear in this sense. But whether you use the concept of biography or itinerary, it helps reconstructing how objects were used and how they transformed, and what was the relationship with humans. I will be coming back to this issue of sustainability, but in the background of this kind of object approach for us has been the idea, if we have these itineraries of wooden objects, making them and using them, can that be kind of help discussing sustainability, which is a very modern contemporary concept, and is there any use in this kind of thinking? But I will be coming back to this idea a bit later. But first, a little bit about our material, so artifacts. In our project, we mostly were interested in portable objects. So whatever you had at your home or any public space, that could be transported quite easily. Of course, architecture, ships, and this kind of bigger, larger objects were part of our work, but not in the focus as such. And there's actually quite a lot of medieval wooden objects in museum collections. And in our project, Janne Harjula, a medieval archaeologist, worked with this material. And he was very successful in his work in identifying different object types and kind of making conclusions of their use and production. And one of the items he has been very interested in are objects related to lighting. And here's a medieval torch from Turku. And in popular culture, you have a lot of movies and TV series where you have medieval environments, and you have torches put on walls. But actually, these kind of torches, they have the light about 10 to 13 minutes. So it's no kind of, it's very kind of short-lived lighting device. But in 30 minutes, you could kind of walk through urban area, perhaps. But they weren't kind of candles that could be lit for hours. But that's the kind of small details that Janne has been working with. And he has been interested in formation processes, so how we have the material that we have, why certain wooden objects have survived and not others? What kind of very physical, chemical processes have affected this, or how people use them? How all this have affected what we have? And because the material is so big, you have to work to some extent with statistics, because there are some groups of objects that you have thousands of, and then you cannot go through all of them. You have to make some samples and statistical analysis. And if you do this, you think about formation processes, so to source material, and try to make some statistics, maybe after that you can do some modeling. So trying to think about itineraries of, not necessarily individual objects because there are so many of them, but object groups and what they tell about medieval life. And I'm not going to go into details about these formation processes, but mostly what we have from the Middle Ages is the waste material in regarding wood, especially if it's urban material. Mostly waste thrown out or forgotten and ending up in landfill or just on the ground. Although some of this material is intentionally put on ground to dry it out. Usually urban areas have very wet grounds, but if you layer the layer of wooden chips and wooden artifacts, they could kind of make it more habitable and easy to use. And Janne mostly worked on materials from Turku, so that's the kind of the most important medieval town in Finland, in southwestern Finland. And he was interested what was the kind of the basic set of objects that you had in a medieval urban household. If you think about wood, what kind of wooden vessels, tools, furniture you had in an ordinary urban house. And also he tried to talk about or think about what species was selected for which purposes. And well, I'll ask you, do you know what this is? Any suggestions? Gitte knows this, but yes.
Et skål.
Yes, it is. It's a stave vessel, and it's made of these smaller triangular pieces which are put together, and you have these kind of fragments, thousands in urban material. And what do you do with that kind of material? That was Janne trying to think about what to do with staves. How about this? I'm sorry, there's not a scale here, but any suggestion of what this might be?
How big is it in centimeter?
It's about less than a meter, about half a meter, half a meter. Good suggestion, but it's actually a whip. 14th century, yes. It has lost the kind of the thread part there, but it's a very nice whip. This, I'm surprised if anybody knows this, but any suggestion on this? It has a very specific function.
Just for fun, while looking for water? That's superstition.
Yeah. No. No. Yes.
It actually looks like an object I've seen before, where you have a line going sort of between the two tips.
Mm-hmm.
And you have sort of counting markers that you hang on this line.
Yes, very good guess, but no. Actually,
An arrow?
no. It's a bit difficult to understand, but if I say that it misses a symmetrical part, exactly the similar looking part, but going, making another circle here or not a curve here, make it kind of circle. It's actually part of animal color. And this just shows how much kind of work you have to do to identify some of these species. You have to use ethnographical sources, so what people used in rural setting in the 19th century. How about this? It's about this size.
A toy?
No. It's cowbell. So it's a wooden cowbell. Yes, it's hollow inside. It's very nice object. And I think this is the last one. And you get this kind of stuff a lot from medieval excavations. But Janne knows or find out what this specific item is. It's a tool, but what kind of tool? No.
Making grain?
No, it's you have flax and then you beat it with this kind of. It's a kind of a knife that you beat the flax with, and it separates the size from actual fibers that you use. So that's for that.
But also have tools for making grain?
Yes, yeah.
I was into it a little bit.
Okay. Oh, there was one more. This is a very specific item, and these are only fragments. They should be kind of rectangular, like about this, and they are about this size. Yes, exactly. So it's a wax tablet. You had wax, and then you wrote on it. And then one more. Any suggestion on this? So it's clearly birch bark, and it's used for fishing. It's a float, and actually birch bark was a very important material. It was even exported from Finland in the Middle Ages. That is known, and you could pay your taxes with birch bark, but also with other natural products. But birch bark was one of those. So when we work with urban material, Janne has been asking where was the raw material acquired? Was it local wood or regional import, export material? But actually archaeological material is very bad in answering that. And then we have some written sources, mostly customs records, but very fragmentary from the Middle Ages. And that usually tells you about trade on timber, not small items like these. And this item on the right, it's actually from an instrument, playing instrument. It's a kind of string instrument, and this is the kind of a head that you had on the other end of the instrument. Then, in addition to these urban finds, we have been working on bog finds. So there are a lot of bogs in Nordic countries, and they keep organic material in very good shape. But it's quite much more accidental what you get, or what survives, what we find, and what ends up in museum collections. And mostly this bog find stuff is skis, sledges, runners, so related to transportation. And there might be some birch bark shoes even in the material, but we haven't got the datings yet. And we have been trying to compare this material with what we have from urban areas, and also what kind of other materials we have for the same kind of purposes. And ancient skis is a kind of own field of research of its own in the Nordic countries. And problem with that material is that the ornamentation and the shapes of skis stays similar for centuries. And unless you have a scientific dating for skis, it's very difficult to say when they were exactly produced. But in Finland, there are about 10 to 15 skis from the Middle Ages. And what's interesting is that they don't have any very specific characteristics in the Middle Ages compared with other periods. So they are found in the same places as in the Iron Age or in the modern period. And the ornamentation is more or less the same. So it's a very stable group of artifacts, ancient skis. And even that can be very interesting in itself. And then we have two art historians working on ecclesiastical sculpture. And they are interested in two kind of things: conservation and material characteristics of these objects, and how they were used as part of material or devotional life. And Nordic countries are in a very specific or special position regarding sculptures because we have so many of them compared to Central Europe, where Reformation wiped so much of the material. And in Finland, there are about 800 sculptures surviving, 1,000 in Sweden. And that's a very big corpus of material from the Middle Ages. And I'm not going to go in very detail what they have found out, but some kind of interesting points regarding archaeology and wood material. In Sweden and Norway, the local production of medieval sculptures or ecclesiastical sculptures starts around in the 12th century. And it seems that the first local products were made of local wood, but that changes into oak in the 13th century. But in Finland, the situation is a bit different because in Finland, the local production starts very late in the mid-14th century. And there were some local wood used, but oak dominates their whole Middle Age, throughout the Middle Ages. So there wasn't kind of this period of local wood dominating. And another point about sculptures is that actually the value of these sculptures was not in the wood. They were covered with pigment, color pigments, textiles, jewelry, and so on. So there was no kind of wish to show the wood, but cover it. And in that sense, the wood didn't have a very significant role in devotional life as such. Although these sculptures themselves were treated in some ways as kind of real representatives of the saints that they depict. So that's a very kind of brief overview of our material that we have been working on. And in connection with Janne's work with urban material, I mentioned that we have thousands of finds to work with. And of course, we need also information about the environment where the wood was kind of logged and gotten into use. And scientific analysis can help here. Some background information, which is probably very familiar to you, but wood was the primary source of energy and raw materials of everyday life, and important for building buildings. And in addition to timber and the wood itself, you could get tar, bark, and other products which were also significant in everyday life. And in the north, forests, of course, covered wide areas. So there were a lot of kind of material to work with, whether you were living in Nordic countries, Russia, or even in Germany. And there are mainly two different biomes that are significant for our research. Of course, the taiga in the north is the vast expanses of forests. with coniferous species. Pine, most importantly. And a bit more south, you have deciduous forests like oak and maple. But for our work, mostly the wood that was used in ordinary lives was pine, spruces, and larches, whereas, for instance, church sculptures was imported from southern areas, oak mainly. And although the environment might seem a kind of stable thing, that the environment stays more or less the same, there were fluctuations in this kind of material that we have. First, you have the medieval warm period in the late Viking Age, early Middle Ages, and at the end of the Middle Ages, you have the Little Ice Age, climate getting colder. And you have to take these into consideration when you try to reconstruct what the environment was like and what was the role of wood in that. And we have some archaeobotanists and botanists working on South Finland, and they are kind of trying to reconstruct the model, what was the environment like from the point of view of trees, and especially in medieval Turku. And in Nordic countries, in all of them, you associate rural areas with forests. And even today in Finland, 75% of land coverage is forests. But it is distributed quite unevenly, and it's mostly relatively young economic forests that we nowadays have. In the Middle Ages, what we know so far is that until about the mid-10th century, forests dominated South Finland. About 96% of land coverage was forests. But that changes with the start of the Middle Ages around 1100, because the population growth was substantial at that time, and cultivation techniques in agriculture developed. And that meant that the forest cover started to decrease in South Finland. And that was accompanied by cattle grazing and making the landscape open in mostly populated areas. And that kind of dramatically changed also the availability of wood, or quality wood especially. And in the 16th century, so after the Middle Ages, the officials of the Swedish state were afraid that forests might diminish too much, that there was overuse of forests, because it has its own economic interest in developing timber trade and so on. But there was some kind of awareness of limitedness of trees after the Middle Ages, or just after the Middle Ages. But in the Middle Ages, the situation varied quite a lot. In very populated areas, like urban areas, they were surrounded by environment without trees. And the same thing can be said about rivers, riversides, and roadsides. They were usually treeless, at least on the basis of archaeobotanic analysis. And we have some court cases in written sources that tell about illegal use of forest. So you went to a neighbor's forest and cut wood from there, or you went to the parish priest's woods and cut illegally wood there, or collected firewood. And all these court cases are from South Finland, which was the most populated area. And it seems that although Finland was a very forested country, or region at that time, there were pockets where the lack of trees was a problem. And the similar process can be seen in medieval Turku. Before the town was founded, the tree pollen from tree species in pollen profiles is about 96%. But when the town was founded around 1300, the role of tree species decreases drastically to about 20%. And that means that the landscape in town and around or in the vicinity of the town was treeless. And this affected especially when you needed high quality wood. In the period of most intensive construction of timber houses in Turku, in the latter part of the 14th century, early 15th century, the availability of wood diminishes quite a lot. And you can see in the logs used in houses, they become much more younger, much more thinner than in earlier periods. And in the mid-16th century, you have also in written sources indications that good construction timber was problematic to get in Turku. So although the country or the region itself was highly forested, in some pockets you had problems getting good wood. And another aspect related to science is the analysis of individual objects. So what we have in museums now. And this is just a very rough estimate in different medieval towns in Northern Europe, and how many. It's very difficult to calculate what is an individual fragment or what is an object, but this gives you at least some scale. Bergen with 66,000 wooden finds, to Stockholm and Turku with about 8,000 wooden finds. And of course Lübeck with about 60,000 wooden finds. And one scholar cannot go through all of this material, at least if he wants to, or she wants to do something else as well. And that's why we are trying to think different ways of approaching this material. And one thing is the identification of tree species. Usually it is done by botanists, by looking at the cell structure of the wood. Or if you have a lot of money, you can do DNA analysis. But when you have these amounts of stuff, you have to have more efficient, more inexpensive way of doing this kind of species analysis. And we have been thinking about this kind of a method that is already available through archaeology by mass spectrometry. It is developed for identifying bones, but potentially it can be used also identifying plants. But the proteins in wood can be a very tricky thing to analyze scientifically. So this is just a very preliminary ideas that we have on this. But it's something that is developed at the moment, and kind of the pioneers are doing it for analyzing contemporary illegal importation and exportation of plants and wood. So you have to have ways to analyze if somebody is illegally importing wood. You have to know where it comes, what is the kind of species that we are looking at. Another thing is that, for instance, in Turku, you have 8,000 finds, and nobody really has gone through them all. And that's why we have a project going on funded by UIB at the moment. It's kind of very in its early phases, trying to develop ways of using computer and digital photographs to identify objects. So you have artificial intelligence program that goes through this visual material and tries to identify what object is in question. And if we succeed in this, we could have a conveyor belt system, and we kind of push through objects from one side and system analyzes them, and then you get object back to collections from the other side. But you have the data, what stuff you have, and what kind of ornamentation there is, and so on. But that's about science. The last part of my presentation, I will be going back to this idea of sustainability and eco-criticism, and what that means, and what the results that we have gotten can contribute into this discussion. You might have heard the concept of eco-criticism at some point in recent years. And it's a broad cultural theory which investigates the global environmental crisis and how culture and physical environment interact and affect or impact this crisis. And eco-criticism has been practiced since the 1970s, but it has expanded in last decades quite a lot. And it's usually in the humanities. It's a interdisciplinary research focused quite a lot on literature studies. And in medieval studies, there is a field of study called medieval eco-criticism, but it's mostly done by literary scholars, and in Nordic countries, it's mostly saga literature that they use when they work on this kind of line of research. And when we talk about medieval eco-criticism, the idea is to kind of think, was the Middle Ages different from our era in approaching the environment or using the environment? What was the medieval attitude to the environment, and can we learn anything from that, studying medieval situation? And or is the Middle Ages already kind of first phase that ends up with our crisis? And in this photograph, I found one specific find from Turku, medieval Turku, and it's a staff made of wood. But what is interesting is the ornamentation on that staff. And there has been debates whether this is a shaman's staff because of the kind of animal ornamentation, or is it just an ordinary walking staff? And you have similar finds from Novgorod, for example. And this find was made in a house, and in that house you had the floor, and underneath the floor you had this staff and a beater for shaman drum, so Sami drum, and that was a kind of bone hammer to hammer the drum, and that's why they might be connected to each other. But it might be a walking staff as well. Back to eco-criticism. And it's a kind of very long-term historical approach, and kind of trying to identify where in the past the ideas that we are now kind of feeling the effects of emerges. And a very kind of influential historian for eco-criticism is Lynn Townsend White. And in 1967, he made this argument that the Christian tree can be no more than a physical fact. And that's why we don't have sacred groves in Christianity. And that tells you a lot about our relationship with the environment, or the Christian relationship with the environment. And this was written about 50, 60 years ago, or even more. And White is not a medievalist, and for medievalist it seems a bit crude how he puts it. But anyway, this is kind of the starting point for eco-criticism and thinking about the Middle Ages and how people saw the environment at that time. And on the right, you have a mystery object. It's missing a half of it, but we don't know really what it is. It's very nicely ornamented. There has been suggestions that it's a sign for a shop that was hung outside the wall or above door, but we don't really know. And we have quite a lot of these kind of objects that we don't know what they were for. So, was medieval wood use sustainable by modern standards if we follow the argumentation in eco-criticism? One important factor in wood use seems to be the population size that you had in one region. And even in Northern Europe, you had areas that suffered from deforestation, like in Denmark. And especially most valuable species like oak and very old large timber used, for example, in shipbuilding could be problematic to find. And in Finland, the problems were focused on urban areas and areas surrounding them. And if you consider that you have a lot of wooden buildings in one place, you need quite a lot of wood. And there's a quite old estimation, but in Oslo, it has been estimated that around 1300 you needed 10 square kilometers of woodland to build all the houses in Oslo at that time. And it can be seen also in Turku and other medieval towns that when there was a very intensive building period, you really kind of logged all wood and trees around urban areas, and that affected the landscape. And this is a recent study published in last year, and in that they amassed a lot of these dendrochronological datings from historical buildings made of wood in all over Europe from 1250 to 1700. And they try to kind of think with using this huge data whether this timber can tell you about demographics or populations and economics in this period. And they could kind of see that the felling dates of these logged timber has a connection with economics and demographics. So, for example, in the mid-14th century, when you have the Black Death, the plague, that affects populations all over Europe, that affects building houses and wood used on those houses, and that can be seen in the age when the wood was logged and put into use. So wood is kind of independent way of looking at fluctuations in people's lives in a very long-term sense. But very important in this respect is that the environment and wood use has very different kind of patterns, whether you are talking about one place or one region or one, if you approach this globally with more bigger perspective. And you can see in this Baltic Sea region, that, for instance, need of oak affected quite a lot the Baltic countries where oak was mostly logged, and that was part of these global networks of trade in the Middle Ages. And some places suffered from the lack of certain wood or quality wood, whereas in other places they were abundantly available. So there are differences in locations. And when trying to study these differences between regions or localities, you are faced with the fact that sources, whether archaeological or written sources, are often very local and individual, and it can be very difficult to make very broad kind of generalizations on sustainability as a whole. But if I try to squeeze out some conclusions about sustainability in relation to these ideas of eco-criticism, on the other hand, you have a lot of recycling and reuse of wood. You could mend objects if they broke down or became worn out. You could use them for other purposes, or you could use them as firework. So in that sense, it was very efficient use of wood. And because wood was everywhere, you could in some sense compare it with plastics. Like in our environment, plastics is everywhere, and in very kind of bad ways. You have plastics from North Pole and Arctic. You have plastics in big oceans, and well, our homes are filled with plastics, and that was the same thing with wood in pre-modern world. But because wood is organic, you don't have the similar environmental problems as with the material itself. In that sense, the wood use was sustainable. But on the other hand, there was clearly overuse of forests in certain areas, especially near urban areas. And you cannot really see that there was it was more dictated by economics and transportation costs and availability and getting wood than any kind of environmental thinking in modern sense. But because forests were so big, on overall it didn't have kind of global big effect. As the final kind of conclusion that you could draw from this material is that reconstructing connections between broad environmental circumstances, small everyday objects, and domestic practices forces us to think similarities and differences between medieval life and with the life that we live at the moment and environmental challenges that we have. So we can move from very ordinary small everyday objects to big issues. And that's kind of the final conclusion that I can make from this material. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Visa. It was super interesting, and yeah, super nice to see such beautiful pictures. I think for all the people that are interested in material culture, it's just yeah, very nice and super interesting subject. I mean, it's a huge subject, so I'm sure a lot of you have questions. Are there any? Yeah. Bendik.
I have a question, if you don't mind. Oh, thank you. Is that okay? Yeah, I had a question, if you don't mind. I was a little bit interested when you talked about the ecclesiastical sculptures that were made of oak. So I was just thinking, I know later on at least, in sort of Central European areas, also lindenwood has been used a lot for making sculptures. Do we find remains of this from sort of medieval era of Finland, or is it exclusively oak?
It's not exclusively oak. There are some a little bit birch and pine, so local woods, but I think that's mostly. There are some other species, but they are in smaller rolls. So mainly oak. And there's an interesting thing that they have been thinking about, these art historians, that in earlier work in Finland, most of the sculptures were identified as birch, but they have shown that it's totally erroneous, that most of the identifications made of these 800 sculptures are wrong, and they should be made again. But because of the scarce resources that we have, only a small fragment of have been reanalyzed. But probably the picture that we have now would change quite dramatically because of the older erroneous analysis. But it seems that mostly they are oak.
Any? Yeah, Gitte?
What you talked about what Janne has been doing, but what did you do?
I'm mostly interested in these bog finds, so skis, sledges, and things that have been found outside urban areas, and comparing that with urban material, and then trying to connect this object material with environmental things. And it's not easy, but I'm trying to do that. And that's why I'm mostly keen on this easy, efficient way of analyzing the wood species, because that would tell you very much about wood use, but it's still a bit too expensive and too slow.
I think that the IA approach, where you can perhaps identify wood species, would be very interesting. But one of the people who are working with the Borgen material is Elisabeth Gudmundsdottir from Iceland, and she uses a method that is very little intrusive, so to speak. I think maybe 1 millimeter by 2 millimeter in a very, very thin slice of the wood, and she identifies the wood species through that.
Yeah.
And that would be, it's easier, it's cheaper probably than the zooms, and it wouldn't take much. It would not take much more than you would have to slice off for zooms investigation.
Yeah.
It seems that she works quite fast. So once you've learned it, it looks as if it's a technique where you can go through really big amounts of wood in a short time. Yeah.
Yes, they are. You're probably right. That's probably. I think that's a kind of dead end that we had with this. But we are trying different methods, and so. But that was most exciting because there are zoom machines available nowadays, and you could try that, and it's very fast. But it's true that it's still not very efficient way to do it. But we have to try other ways as well. Yeah. But with the AI, I could add that in addition to kind of identifying the species, we are also interested if you could kind of identify the object category. So you have a stave fragment, or you have a wax tablet, and if computer could do that. But we'll have to see, because we are in so pioneering phase with that. Yeah.
You probably know that there are quite a few people who have tried to identify pottery, medieval pottery or pottery altogether through digital tools. Yeah. It would be wonderful if you could just take a picture. And then we didn't need archaeologists either.
Yeah, there's now quite a lot of activity in that area, but altogether I would say that it's promising, but not yet kind of breakthrough yet. Yeah. So more work on that as well.
Thank you for an interesting glance into the Middle Ages and wood. My name is Ivar. I'm coming from a part of the western country in Hardanger area, and we are used to brewery, beer, and I just want to know how about artifacts connecting to that culture by making beer with, for example, barrels or drinking vessels and stuff like that. And also another question is how about toys and how about kind of almost and then not identical for use, but a kind of simple wooden, like a little stick or something could be played with, or could be a symbol for a conversation tool for small children or whatever, grown-ups. Yeah, those two main areas.
I start with the toys. In wood material, we have toys, so small figures depicting humans, and then we have small boats and small arrows and bows, so clearly done for children. So we have a different kind of toys there, and I didn't have any pictures of those, but they are very interesting group of artifacts. So we certainly have those, and then breweries. We have, of course, barrels and different vats, so big vessels that could be used in brewing. And then we have some very specifically built log houses that might be kind of cisterns for collecting water and then piping it to the brewery, because breweries use quite a lot of water. So we have architectural features and then individual artifacts that can be associated with brewing. Yes. And then drinking vessels. Well, we have different kind of cups and stay vessels. But if you had beer, you might use also ceramics and glass and stuff like that.
Yeah. Last question. How about sauna artifacts from Finland? Is it possible to find?
Well, we have saunas, definitely. Buildings with hearths with stones or ovens with stones that are clearly used as saunas. And in traditional housing, up to 19th century, you had basically houses that were used saunas at the same time. So people lived them, but you could also have a sauna there. But more specific, if you think about these kind of vessels for water and drawing water, well, I don't know if anybody has kind of identified that these kind of vessels were specifically used in saunas, but there are definitely things that could be used in saunas.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? Looking at the chat. No? Yeah, Benedict?
Yeah. If you don't mind,
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking about one thing that you mentioned at the start, or a bit into this lecture, about the meaning of different type of woods, or what kind of call it symbolism was associated with it. I found that quite interesting, and I was thinking about it in relation to these the imported oak that was used for ecclesiastical sculptures, because in my experience, oak is not a very easy material to carve. It's it's kind of hard,
Yeah,
and you wear out the edges of your tools relatively quickly, so it takes more time. And in a sculpture, you don't have a particular need for it to be particularly wear resistant or rot resistant. So you don't really need the two really good qualities about oak.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking, do you think this is that they have chosen oak because it was somehow associated with being the sort of best kind of wood, and then it would be used for these religious purposes? And do we have any other examples of wood being chosen specifically because of its symbolical significance rather than its technical qualities?
Yeah. First with choosing oak, it happens in all Northern Europe that at some point in the Middle Ages, oak starts to dominate wooden sculptures, as I have understood it. And it's to do with the fact that also, although it's difficult to carve oak, you can make more details or more detailed carving. And also the fact that, especially in Finland, if you use pine, which is abundantly available, it cracks quite easily. Whereas in oak, you can prevent that happening if you dry it very well. So, but otherwise, I don't think there has been any indications that they had chosen oak for some kind of meaning attached to oak related to religion or Christianity, and that's why they have chosen oak. In that sense, I don't think there is any kind of religious meaning related to oak. But it might be both a practical thing, also to do with the fact that oak was expensive, so you made more important things in expensive materials. And maybe it's also fashionable to have oak instead of local wood.
I had a question about the birch bark, because you said it was exported and used for taxation.
Yeah.
Why was it used for taxation? And also, how far was it exported?
Well, what we know from written sources, it's exported to kind of Estonia and across the Baltic Sea, so not that far away, but still in regionally exported. And well, you could use birch bark for many things, but it's very good for insulation if you kind of want to stop dampness going in the buildings. It's very useful for that. But of course, in Novgorod you have birch bark letters that you could write on, but that's very specific use. But actually, in Turku they have found one birch bark letter so far. Maybe there will be more later. But building is the kind of the main thing.
Okay, because does that mean Estonia, they don't have trees that produce birch of that good quality as in Finland, or?
I think it's more to do with the fact that when you had this intensive period of building, you needed a lot of raw material, and then just local wood or local forests were not just enough.
Yeah.
So you just needed more birch bark.
And do you, for harvesting the bark, can you keep the tree alive, or do you need to fell it?
Yeah, you need to cut it.
Okay.
Or you kill the tree if you take the birch bark.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think Matthias had a question.
Just a follow-up on that birch bark leather, because I hadn't heard about that before. Was that written in like old Church Slavonic, like the ones in Novgorod, or was it written in Finnish?
It was probably written in Latin.
All right.
It was found in connection or very close to a cathedral school. And the problem is that it's very faint, the text, and they have tried to use different imaging techniques to get the text out. And another problem is that Latinists are not very keen of interpreting the text. They are very kind of careful not to make mistakes, and therefore I think archaeologists won't get any kind of clear answer what it says. But it seems that it is some kind of scribble that somebody has perhaps practiced writing, but we don't really know. It seems to again, this is not certain, but it seems to refer to Virgin Mary in some sense, but it's very unclear. But interesting point about the birch bark letter was that in previous excavations, they have found quite a lot of these scrolled up birch bark fragments, and they have just thrown them away. But once they kind of unscrolled it, and they found out it was a letter, and after that they have kind of started unscrolling every birch bark that they found. But they might have thrown away letters earlier.
Can I just ask again? Did you say that when you take away the birch bark, the tree dies?
Yeah, eventually. So
Eventually, because it is possible, isn't it, to sort of harvest?
Yes, it's possible to harvest, but not too much.
Yeah.
And you have to have a kind of periods that you don't harvest the same tree.
Yeah.
But it's possible, but not too much.
Thank you.
About eco-criticism, you had a note there what we can eventually or possibly learn from the way they used their resources, and how is the possibility and how much can we learn if you look at in the modern way. It's of course it's a discrepancy between these times, and you have to consider. But still, what can we, in very general words, learn from? We have a big crisis on many levels right now.
Well, one thing that you can learn that the medieval people weren't better than us in economic terms. There were just less of them using environmental sources. So in that sense, maybe it relieves us a bit that people previously haven't done any better than us, but it's only just that there weren't so many of them. But in terms of artifacts, you could think that, as I said, that wooden artifacts are actually sustainable in the sense that they are organic material and you can recycle and then you can burn them. And if we would use more wood and try to find uses for wood in places that we now use plastics, maybe that could help. And it's kind of interesting that what kind of variety of things that they made of wood and had in their lives. But they are not kind of very direct applications that we could use nowadays. It's more kind of perhaps do more thinking what we could do with wood nowadays.
Can I just ask, what's the scale of these? Are these chess pieces or?
They are chess pieces and they are quite small. Yeah.
Okay. I think that's all. Thank you again, Visa, a lot for this. We really enjoyed it. Thank you for everyone who came. I will advertise that next Friday we will have a talk by Svein Vatsvåg Nielsen, who is a recent PhD from Oslo, and he will talk about the Neolithization of Norway. It will be in the same room here. And now for the ones who have time, we will go for Ad Fontes and have a beer. So anyone that wants to join, you are welcome. Thank you again,
Thank you.
Lisa.
Thanks.